They called her a curse, a mistake hidden under a heavy, stained burlap sack. In the cruel valley town of Whispering Pines, a young woman stood on a wooden crate, her face veiled from the world as if she were a monster from a ghost story. The man who had paid for her passage took one look at her through a small slit in the fabric and spat at her feet. He rejected her right there in the dirt. But standing in the shadows was Gideon Thorne, a man who knew that the wild mountain didn't care about a person's face, only their heart. He was about to make a trade that would change both their lives forever.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Before we begin this journey of redemption and survival, pull up a chair by the hearth. If you love stories of the Old West and the strength of the human spirit, please subscribe and ring that bell. Your support keeps these forgotten fires burning. Now, let's head into the high timber.
The air in the valley was thick with the smell of dust and the sound of mockery. Gideon Thorne adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders. He didn't come to town often. He preferred the silence of the high ridges, where the only voices were the wind in the pines and the rushing of the meltwater. Gideon walked toward the trading post. His pack was filled with the labor of a long summer. He had carefully harvested wild ginseng and dried golden seal roots, valuable medicinal plants that the valley doctors paid well for. In those days, a mountain man had to know his plants. Knowing the difference between a healing root and a poisonous one was the thin line between life and death. He also carried a small cedar chest he had carved by hand, the wood polished with beeswax until it shone like gold. As he reached the center of the settlement, a crowd blocked his path. They were gathered around a makeshift stage. On top of it stood a man named Miller, a wealthy landowner with a heart as cold as a mountain winter. Beside him stood a woman. She wore a dress of fine blue silk, but it was dusty and torn at the hem. Most shocking of all was the rough burlap sack tied loosely around her neck, covering her entire head. Small holes had been cut for her eyes, but she kept them fixed on the floorboards. "I paid for a bride, not a riddle," Miller shouted, his voice booming across the square. "She arrived on the stagecoach like this. The driver says she refused to show her face the whole way from the east, says she's marked by the devil himself." The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound. In the 1800s, superstition often took the place of kindness. People feared what they didn't understand. "She's a rejected shipment," Miller yelled. "I won't have her in my house. Someone take this thing off my hands before I run her out of town." The woman flinched. Gideon felt a spark of heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He looked at her hands. They were trembling, but her posture was straight. She wasn't a thing. She was a human soul being discarded like spoiled grain. Gideon stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his heavy boots. The laughter died down as the mountain man moved through the crowd. He didn't say a word. He simply unbuckled his pack and set the hand-carved cedar chest on the edge of the stage. Miller looked at the chest, then at the bags of rare medicinal roots. He knew the value of Gideon's work. "I'll take her," Gideon said, his voice deep and steady like the earth itself. The crowd went silent. Miller smirked, thinking he was getting the better end of the deal. He grabbed the chest and signaled for the woman to step down. Gideon reached out a hand to help her. She hesitated, then placed her small, cold hand in his calloused palm. He could feel her heart racing through her pulse. "Let's go," Gideon whispered. "The mountain is a long climb, and the sun is starting to dip." As they turned to leave, Miller shouted one last jeer. "Better keep that sack on her, Thorne. You might not like what's underneath." Gideon didn't look back. He led the silent woman toward the trail that climbed into the clouds. He had bought her freedom, But as they reached the first steep incline, he realized he didn't even know her name.
The dust of whispering pines began to settle behind them, but the echoes of the crowd's laughter seemed to follow them like a bad smell. Gideon didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the narrow, winding trail that led into the foothills. His heart was still hammering against his ribs. He had just traded a season's worth of hard labor, the finest cedar wood and the rarest medicinal roots, for a woman whose face he hadn't even seen. In the 1800s, a mountain man's wealth wasn't measured in gold coins. It was measured in what he could create and what he could harvest from the earth. The golden seal and ginseng Gideon had traded were known as nature's pharmacy. Back then, these roots were worth their weight in silver to doctors in the East who lacked modern medicine. By giving them up, Gideon was sacrificing his own safety net for the coming winter. But as he glanced at the woman walking beside him, stumbling slightly in her thin city shoes, he knew he couldn't have left her there. "The trail gets steeper from here," Gideon said, his voice softening. He noticed her breathing was heavy. High-altitude air is thin, and for someone used to the sea-level moisture of the East, every step can feel like a mountain itself. "We'll take it slow. The ridge doesn't move. It'll wait for us." She didn't answer. The burlap sack shifted as she nodded, the rough fabric scratching against her silk collar. Gideon realized she was probably terrified. She had been sold like a bag of grain to a stranger who lived in the clouds. "I have a name," he said, trying to bridge the silence. "I'm Gideon Thorne. I built a cabin up on the high ridge. It's quiet there. No one to point fingers or tell lies." He stopped for a moment to adjust the straps of his remaining gear. A good mountain man knows that a poorly balanced load is a recipe for a broken ankle. He took a canteen from his belt, made of hardened leather, and offered it to her. "Drink," he urged. "The mountain takes more out of you than you think." She reached out, her fingers brushing his. She carefully lifted the bottom of the sack just enough to take a sip of the cool spring water. "Josephine," she whispered. Her voice was like the first thaw of spring, cracked but full of hidden life. "My name is Josephine Mercer." "Josephine," Gideon repeated, testing the weight of it. "Well, Josephine, we have 6 miles of timber to cross before we hit the cabin. Stay close. The light is fading, and the mountain has a way of changing its face when the sun goes down." As they stepped into the deep shadow of the towering Douglas firs, the world of men vanished. But as the darkness grew, Gideon realized the real challenge wasn't the climb, it was the mystery walking right beside him. The forest changes when the sun dips below the granite peaks. Shadows stretch out like long, dark fingers, and the temperature drops faster than a stone in a well. As Gideon and Josephine climbed higher, the air grew crisp, smelling of damp earth and ancient pine resin. In the high country, you don't just see the cold, you feel it in your bones. Gideon kept a steady pace, but he was constantly looking back. He knew the dangers of this trail. In the 1800s, mountain travel wasn't just about endurance, it was about awareness. He watched the canopy above them, looking for widowmakers, large dead branches that could snap and fall without a moment's notice. He also kept his ears open for the sound of shifting rock. "Step where I step, Josephine," he cautioned quietly. "Keep your weight over the balls of your feet. That's the mountain walk. It keeps your balance centered on the loose scree." She followed his instructions without a word. He noticed how she struggled with the burlap sack. The fabric was thick, and in the fading light, it must have been like trying to walk through a fog. She tripped over a protruding cedar root, and Gideon caught her arm before she could tumble down the slope. Her sleeve was thin, and he could feel how much she was shivering. "We need to get you warm. In these heights, damp skin and cold wind are a deadly pair. It's what the old-timers call the silent chill. If your body temperature drops too far, your mind starts to wander before your heart gives out. He took a heavy wool blanket from his pack and draped it over her shoulders. Wool was a homesteader's best friend because it stays warm even when it's wet. Josephine pulled the blanket tight, her breath puffing in small white clouds through the holes in her mask. The final mile was the hardest. The trail narrowed until it was just a ribbon of dirt hugging the side of the ridge. Below them, the valley was a sea of darkness. Above, the stars began to pierce the sky like silver nails. Finally, the trees thinned, and a small, sturdy cabin came into view. It was built of hand-hewn logs, tucked into the shelter of a limestone overhang. They reached the heavy timber door. Gideon pushed it open, and the scent of dried herbs and old wood smoke greeted them. He stepped inside and struck a match, lighting a tallow candle. The small flame danced, casting long shadows against the walls. "You're safe now," Gideon said, turning to her. "You can take that thing off your head. There's no one here to judge you but the mountain, and she's seen everything." Josephine stood by the hearth, her hands frozen at her throat. The moment of truth had arrived.
The small candle flame flickered in the draft, casting a golden glow across the hand-planed cedar walls. Josephine stood perfectly still. Her fingers knotted at the twine that held the burlap sack in place. Gideon stepped back, giving her space. In the silence of the high ridge, the only sound was the popping of the kindling as the fire began to take hold in the hearth. "You don't have to fear me, Josephine," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic rumble. "Up here, we live by the laws of the mountain, and the first law is that every soul deserves a sanctuary." In the 1800s, a cabin wasn't just a house, it was a fortress against the elements. The logs were chinked with a mixture of mud, straw, and horsehair to keep out the biting wind. It was a place where the harshness of the outside world was supposed to stop at the threshold. Slowly, with trembling hands, Josephine untied the knot. She pulled the rough fabric upward. As the sack fell to the floor with a soft thud, the light of the fire hit her face fully for the first time. Gideon's breath hitched. He felt his chest tighten, and an audible gasp escaped his lips. Josephine flinched. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if she expected him to cast her out into the freezing night, just as Miller had. She braced herself for the insults, the talk of devil's marks and unholy omens. But Gideon wasn't looking at a monster. Across the left side of her face, stretching from her temple down to the curve of her jaw, was a deep, wine-colored mark. It wasn't a scar or a deformity. It was a birthmark that looked like a map of a distant, sunset-drenched canyon. And her eyes, one was the deep, dark brown of mountain earth, while the other was a startling, piercing blue, like the ice at the heart of a glacier. You're staring," she whispered, her voice trembling with a lifetime of shame. Gideon took a step closer, his eyes wide with genuine wonder. "I've spent my life looking at the beauty of this world, Josephine. I've seen the way the sun hits the granite at dawn and the way the wildflowers paint the meadows in July." He shook his head slowly. "The folks in that valley, they're blind. They called this a curse because they've never seen anything so unique." He reached out, pausing to ensure she didn't pull away, and gently gestured toward the birthmark. "It looks like the sky just before a storm breaks. It's the mountain's own colors." Josephine looked at him, her blue eye and her brown eye searching his face for a hint of mockery. She found none. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being looked at with horror. She was being seen. "You really don't think it's ugly?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Gideon smiled, a rare, warm expression that crinkled the skin around his eyes. Ugly is a word for a man's heart, not a woman's face. Now, let's get some food in you. The mountain doesn't care what you look like, but it surely cares if you're hungry." The tension that had held Josephine's shoulders tight for years seemed to melt away, much like the mountain snow under a Chinook wind. For the first time, she didn't reach for the burlap sack to hide. Instead, she watched Gideon move around the cabin with a purposeful, quiet grace. This was the beginning of a new rhythm, the rhythm of survival on the high ridge. In the 1800s, a mountain home was a living machine. Every object had a function, and every hour was a stitch in the quilt of staying alive. Gideon set a heavy cast-iron pot over the fire, the seasoned metal singing as it heated. He began to prepare a meal of dried venison jerky, rehydrated in a broth of wild onions and shriveled crab apples he had gathered before the first frost. "On the ridge, we don't waste a thing," Gideon explained, his voice conversational and warm. "These onions grow in the rocky patches where the drainage is good. They're small, but they keep the blood strong when the winter winds start to howl." He handed her a wooden bowl and a spoon he had carved from birch. As she ate, Josephine looked around the cabin. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, yarrow for stopping bleeds, and willow bark, which acted as a natural remedy for aches and fevers. To the folks in the valley, these were just weeds. To a homesteader, they were a lifeline. "I can help," Josephine said suddenly, her voice gaining a bit of its natural strength. "I'm not just a burden you bought, Gideon. I can sew, and I know how to keep a hearth clean. Back east, I studied the ledgers for my father's shop. I can read and write." Gideon paused, leaning against the rough-hewn mantel. "Skills are worth more than gold up here, Josephine. A sharp mind is just as important as a sharp axe. If you can track our supplies and help me keep this place tight against the drafts, then you're more than a partner. You're the heart of this cabin." As the days turned into weeks, the frost between them continued to break. Gideon taught her the language of the mountain, how to tell the temperature by the sound of the crickets, and how to smell the coming rain in the wind. But as the air grew sharper and the birds began their long flight south, a new shadow began to loom over the ridge. The sky was turning a heavy, bruised purple, and the old-timers' warnings about a 100-year winter started to feel less like a legend and more like a coming storm. The sky above the ridge had turned a deep, bruised shade of charcoal, and the wind began to whistle through the high pines with a mournful, hollow sound. Gideon stood on the porch, his eyes narrowed as he watched the horizon. In the Old West, a man didn't need a barometer to know a storm was coming. He felt it in the ache of his joints and the way the forest went unnaturally silent. "The chickadees have gone to ground," Gideon remarked, his voice tight. "That's the mountain's warning bell. When the birds stop singing, the sky is about to speak." In the 1800s, an early blizzard wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a siege. If you weren't prepared, the cold could find the smallest crack in your walls and steal the heat from your body before morning. Gideon knew they had only hours before the big white descended. "Josephine," he called out, "we have work to do. We need to chink the north wall. The summer heat has shrunk the logs, and if the wind gets through those gaps, no fire in the world will keep us warm." Josephine didn't hesitate. She stepped out into the biting air, wrapping her wool shawl tight. Gideon showed her how to mix a daubin paste, a traditional survival mixture of clay-rich mud, dried grass, and a bit of ash from the hearth. This wasn't just chores, it was engineering. The mud provided the seal, while the grass acted like rebar, giving the mixture strength so it wouldn't crack and fall out when it froze. Together, they worked with frantic energy. Josephine used a flat wooden trowel to press the thick gray paste into the crevices between the heavy hemlock logs. Her hands were stained with earth, and her breath came in ragged puffs, but she didn't complain once. She was no longer the fragile girl in the burlap sack. She was a woman fighting for her home. While she sealed the walls, Gideon hauled the last of the seasoned oak into the lean-to. He explained the importance of dry stacking, keeping the wood off the damp ground so it wouldn't rot or hiss in the fire. Hardwoods like oak and hickory were the gold of the winter. They burned slow and hot, holding the coals long into the night. And just as the first fat, heavy flakes of snow began to drift down, they hammered the final seal onto the door frame. The world was disappearing into a wall of white. "Inside," Gideon urged, ushering her through the door. "The mountain is closing its doors." As he dropped the heavy oak bar across the entrance, the first true gust of the blizzard slammed into the cabin. The logs groaned, but they held firm. They were locked in now, just the two of them, against a winter that promised to be legendary.
The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. All that remained was the roar of the wind, sounding like 1,000 freight trains passing over the roof. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the earthy aroma of the mud chinking drying against the logs. The blizzard had turned the high ridge into an island of white, and for the first time in their lives, Gideon and Josephine were truly alone with their thoughts. In the 1800s, a whiteout was a psychological test as much as a physical one. Without the sun to track the hours, time became a fluid thing. To keep their spirits high, Gideon focused on the essential tasks of indoor survival. He showed Josephine how to render tallow from saved fat to make candles, a vital skill when oil was scarce. "The light from a tallow candle is humble," Gideon said, his voice a steady anchor against the howling wind. "But it's enough to read by, and enough to remind you that the dark hasn't won." They sat by the hearth, the flickering light dancing across Josephine's birthmark. Under the safety of the storm, she finally began to peel back the layers of her past. She told him of the city back east, where beauty was a currency and she was considered bankrupt. She spoke of the stares, the whispers of bad omens, and the father who had arranged her marriage just to move her out of his sight. "I spent 20 years trying to be invisible, Gideon," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers. "The world is a harsh teacher, Josephine. It tries to break anything that doesn't fit in a neat little box. But look at this mountain. It's jagged, it's scarred, and it's unpredictable. And yet people travel across oceans just to catch a glimpse of its glory." As the days passed, their bond deepened into something stronger than mere companionship. They shared stories not just of pain, but of dreams. Gideon spoke of his desire to build a sanctuary for those the world had cast aside, a place where the misfits of the valley could find peace. But as the storm finally began to taper off on the 5th day, a new sound broke the silence. It wasn't the wind or the shifting ice. It was a faint, frantic pounding on the heavy oak door. Someone was out there in the drifts, and they were running out of time.
Gideon's hand flew to the heavy oak bar. In the high timber, a knock during a blizzard usually meant a soul was at heaven's door. He heaved the door open, a wall of powdery snow collapsing into the cabin. There, shivering and blue-lipped, was a young traveler who had been caught in the sudden whiteout. In the 1800s, the law of the ridge was simple. You never turned a traveler away from your fire. Gideon and Josephine worked as a seamless team. While Gideon helped the man to the hearth, Josephine practiced the survival medicine Gideon had taught her. She didn't wrap the man in hot blankets immediately. That could cause shock. Instead, she gave him lukewarm pine needle tea, rich in vitamin C, and used cool friction to slowly bring the circulation back to his hands. The traveler stayed for 2 days until the paths were clear. When he looked at Josephine, he didn't recoil. He saw a woman who had saved his life with her knowledge and her steady hands. When he finally descended back to the valley, he took with him a story, not of a cursed bride, but of a mountain queen who lived among the clouds. Weeks bled into months, and the 100-year winter finally began to lose its grip. The thaw in the mountains is a violent, beautiful thing. The ice out happens when the frozen creeks suddenly break, the water rushing down the slopes with a sound like rolling thunder. "Listen to that, Josephine," Gideon said, standing in the doorway as the first green shoots of bear grass poked through the receding drifts. "The mountain is waking up, and so are we." Educationally, the spring thaw was the most critical time for a homesteader. Gideon showed Josephine how to tap the sugar maples that grew on the southern slope. By drilling a small hole and using a hollowed elderberry branch as a spile, they collected the clear, slightly sweet sap. "You boil it down until it's thick and dark," Gideon explained. "It's the first taste of sweetness after a bitter winter. It reminds the body that life is returning." They worked together, preparing the rocky soil for the three sisters' planting method: corn, beans, and squash. The corn provides a ladder for the beans to climb, while the squash leaves shade the ground, keeping the moisture in. This ancient wisdom was the key to their future. Josephine realized that the birthmark on her face no longer felt like a brand of shame. It felt like the map of the land she had conquered. But as the trails cleared, the peace of the ridge was about to be challenged. A lone rider was making his way up the path, a face from the past that Josephine hoped she'd never see again.
The rhythmic thud of hooves against the softening mud echoed through the canyon. Gideon felt the shift in the air before he saw the rider. On the ridge, a visitor was rarely a coincidence. They were either lost or looking for trouble. As the horse broke through the tree line, Josephine's face went pale. It was Miller, the wealthy man from the valley who had discarded her like a broken tool. He looked out of place in his fine wool coat and polished boots, his horse lathered with sweat from the climb. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on Josephine. He didn't see the frightened girl in the burlap sack anymore. He saw a woman standing tall, her face uncovered, glowing with the health of a mountain winter. "So the rumors were true," Miller sneered, his voice cutting through the peaceful mountain air. "The monster survived the frost? I've come to take back my property, Thorne. That contract I signed over, I'm declaring it void. A man of my standing shouldn't have been cheated out of a bride with such striking features." Gideon stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with the steady, immovable presence of an old-growth oak. He knew that in the territory, the law was often what you carried in your heart. "The mountain doesn't recognize your contracts, Miller, and Josephine isn't property. She's a free soul who's earned her place on this ridge." Miller laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "She's a marked woman. No one in the valley will take her in if I say she's cursed. You think you can survive up here forever?" Josephine stepped beside Gideon, her eyes flashing, one brown, one blue, like the very earth and sky they stood upon. She didn't hide her face. She leaned into the light. "I don't need the valley, Mr. Miller. I've learned how to read the clouds and heal with the roots. I've survived the great whiteout while you sat by your coal fire. You didn't reject me, you released me." Gideon watched the horizon. He noticed the way the wind was shifting from the west, bringing a sudden, heavy mist that often confused those unfamiliar with the ridge's geography. "The ghost fog is rolling in, Miller," Gideon said calmly. "If you don't turn that horse around now, the trail will vanish and the ridge will decide your fate. I suggest you head down while you still know which way is gravity." In the Old West, ghost fogs were localized weather phenomena where moisture trapped in the valleys would rise and thicken instantly, disorienting travelers. Fearing the mountain more than he hated being defied, Miller looked at the encroaching wall of gray, cursed under his breath, and yanked his horse's head around. As the fog swallowed the sound of his retreat, Josephine felt the final weight of her past dissolve into the mist. She was no longer a rejected bride. She was a woman of the high ridge.
The ghost fog lingered for a while, wrapping the cabin in a silent white cocoon. But by evening, a golden sun broke through the vapor. The ridge was quiet once more, cleansed of the cruelty Miller had brought with him. Gideon and Josephine stood on the porch, watching the light catch the new buds on the aspen trees. The world felt fresh, like a page that had finally been turned. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the mountain wedding was often a simple affair. Out of reach of town preachers and grand cathedrals, couples made their vows to the land and to each other. It was a covenant of survival and soul. Gideon turned to Josephine, his eyes reflecting the soft amber of the sunset. "I didn't just buy a contract that day in the valley," Gideon said softly. "I was looking for a reason to stay on this mountain. I thought I wanted solitude, but I realize now I was just waiting for someone who saw the world the way I do." Josephine smiled, and for the first time she didn't think about the mark on her face. She thought about the strength in her hands, the hands that had chinked E's walls, harvested the maple sap, and saved a traveler's life. "You saw me when I was hidden," she replied. "You taught me that the mountain doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for resilience." Gideon reached into the pocket of his buckskin vest and pulled out 2 rings he had spent the last few weeks carving. They weren't made of gold or silver, but of dark, polished mountain mahogany, a wood so dense and hardy it was often called ironwood. In the language of the woods, it symbolized a bond that would never warp or break under pressure. "With this wood and this ridge as my witness," Gideon whispered, sliding the ring on her finger, "I promise to stand between you and the wind." Josephine placed the other ring on his hand, her voice steady and clear. "And I promise to keep the hearth warm and the light burning, no matter how deep the snow falls." They didn't need a crowd to cheer or a bell to ring. The wind in the pines provided the music, and the stars provided the witnesses. As they walked back into their cabin, the home they had built together, Josephine realized she wasn't a rejected bride anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The curse the town had seen was actually the map that had led her home to the ridge.
Thank you for joining us for this journey of love and resilience on the high ridge. Gideon and Josephine's story reminds us that true beauty isn't found in a mirror, but in the courage to be ourselves in a world that asks us to hide. What did you think of Josephine's transformation? Have you ever felt like an outsider only to find your true home later in life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge. It helps us keep these Old West legends alive. Be sure to check out our Mountain Survival playlist for more tales of redemption. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and may your own trail lead you to peace.